When was the last time you finished a book? Not started one, finished one. When was the last time you had a conversation that didn't feel exhausting? When was the last time you went for a walk and actually enjoyed it instead of reaching for your phone? If you've noticed that nothing feels rewarding anymore, that activities you used to enjoy now feel boring, slow, or effortful, you're not alone, and you're not broken. What you're experiencing has a name: anhedonia. The inability to feel pleasure from previously rewarding activities. And there's a specific neurobiological mechanism explaining why it's happening to you right now. This video examines that mechanism, how short-form content platforms recalibrate your brain's reward system over months, creating a chronic dopamine deficit state where everyday life stops registering as pleasurable. We'll cover the neuroscience, the timeline, what research actually shows, and what remains uncertain. All sources cited in this video are listed with full details in the description. No easy fixes, just the mechanism. Let's start with what this actually looks like in practice. Here's the pattern. You open TikTok for just 2 minutes. An hour disappears. You close the app feeling vaguely guilty, slightly numb, and immediately bored by everything around you. Reading feels impossibly slow. Conversation requires effort you don't have. Even activities you genuinely enjoyed 6 months ago, cooking, exercise, socializing, now feel like obligations. You're not depressed in the clinical sense. You're not anxious about specific things. You're just numb. Nothing feels good. According to data from 2025, Gen Z averages 9 hours daily on screens, with a significant portion on short-form video platforms. Meanwhile, a 2025 NIH review found that heavy social media use consistently correlates with reduced capacity to experience pleasure from non-digital activities, what researchers term digital anhedonia. Brain scans show altered activation patterns in the nucleus accumbens and ventral striatum, regions central to reward processing. Let's trace a typical progression. Month 1, you discover TikTok, 20 to 30 minutes daily. Entertaining, novel, harmless. Month 3, usage climbs to 1 to 2 hours daily. You notice you reach for your phone automatically when waiting, when bored, when anxious. Month 6, 2 to 4 hours daily. Reading feels slow. Your mind wanders after a page. Conversations feel tedious unless constantly stimulating. Nature walks feel unstimulating unless you're simultaneously scrolling. Month 12, you recognize the problem. Nothing is fun anymore. Nothing feels good. You seek the app not for pleasure, but to escape the numbness. You try to quit. Withdrawal is real. Restlessness, irritability, I don't know what to do with myself. You relapse within days. So the question becomes, what is happening inside your brain during those 12 months? What mechanism transforms entertainment into anhedonia? To understand that, we need to look at 3 systems and how they intersect. First, we need to correct a fundamental misconception. Dopamine is not the pleasure chemical. Dopamine is the anticipation chemical, the motivation system, the wanting system. Here's how it works. The mesolimbic dopamine pathway runs from the ventral tegmental area to the nucleus accumbens. It encodes reward prediction errors, the difference between what you expect and what you receive. When outcomes are better than expected, dopamine spikes, reinforcing the behavior. When outcomes match expectations, dopamine remains stable. When outcomes are worse than expected, dopamine drops below baseline, creating an aversive state. Here's the critical distinction. Dopamine creates desire, not satisfaction. actual pleasure, the subjective experience of "this feels good," involves opioid and serotonin systems. Dopamine makes you want the reward. Opioids and serotonin make you like the reward once you have it. This distinction matters because short-form content platforms hyperactivate your dopamine system, creating chronic wanting while potentially suppressing serotonin activity, which normally signals contentment and patience. The result? You feel perpetually motivated to seek the next video, the next swipe, the next dopamine hit, but you never feel satisfied. High wanting, low liking. Now, how do platforms exploit this dopamine system? Through variable reward schedules, the most addictive reinforcement pattern ever identified in behavioral psychology. B.F. Skinner discovered this in the 1950s. If you reward a behavior unpredictably, sometimes after 2 attempts, sometimes after 20, with no discernible pattern, you create persistent, compulsive behavior that's extraordinarily resistant to extinction. This is how slot machines work. Pull the lever, sometimes you win, sometimes you don't, but you never know which pull will pay off. That uncertainty creates persistent anticipatory dopamine release. You're not chasing pleasure, you're chasing the anticipation of pleasure. TikTok operates identically. User performs behavior, swipes to next video. Outcome is uncertain. Will it be funny, boring, novel? Sometimes the outcome is highly rewarding, a viral video, unexpected content that perfectly matches your current mood. Sometimes the outcome is mediocre. That unpredictability creates persistent anticipatory dopamine release, driving compulsive swiping. Here's where it gets engineered. Platform algorithms track extensive behavioral signals per video. Reverse engineering studies and platform documentation suggest hundreds to over 1,000 distinct signals per interaction. The algorithm knows your reward threshold, how engaging content needs to be to keep you scrolling. It delivers highly engaging content at variable intervals, calibrated individually to maximize retention. If you start disengaging, faster swipes, more skips, the algorithm temporarily increases reward frequency. Once you're re-engaged, it returns to the variable schedule. So, what happens when your brain experiences these repeated dopamine spikes over months? It adapts. Neural adaptation occurs in phases. Acute phase, 0 to 7 days, immediate dopamine spikes during use, followed by baseline crash post-use. Subacute phase, 1 to 4 weeks, tolerance develops. The same content produces a smaller dopamine response. You unconsciously compensate by increasing usage duration and frequency. Chronic phase, 3+ months. This is where structural changes become measurable. Your brain detects repeated supranormal dopamine spikes and triggers compensatory downregulation. Specifically, it reduces the density of dopamine receptors on neuron surfaces and lowers baseline dopamine production. This adaptation is protective in the short term. Your brain is trying to maintain equilibrium in the face of abnormal stimulation, but it's maladaptive chronically. Here's what this looks like functionally. Normal activities, reading, conversation, nature, produced sufficient dopamine to register as pleasurable when your baseline was normal. But now, your baseline has dropped and your receptor density has decreased. Those same activities don't produce enough dopamine to cross your new elevated threshold for pleasure. They feel boring, effortful, unrewarding. not because they've changed, but because your reward system has recalibrated to supranormal stimulation. Research suggests these structural changes require approximately 3 to 6 months of consistent heavy use, defined as 1 to 2+ hours daily of short-form content. But this timeline varies substantially based on genetics, personality traits, age, and usage intensity. One final piece. Why does short-form content create wanting without satisfaction? Because dopamine and serotonin serve opposing functions. Research from Stanford, published in October 2025, demonstrates what researchers call the opponency hypothesis. Dopamine acts as the go signal, promoting reward-seeking and immediate action. Serotonin acts as the wait signal, promoting patience, long-term thinking, and contentment with your current state. Effective decision-making requires balance between both systems. Short-form content chronically activates dopamine, constant novelty, variable rewards, endless scroll, while potentially suppressing serotonin activity. There's no natural endpoint, no satisfaction, no sense of enough. This creates a state of perpetual wanting without liking, perpetual seeking without finding. You scroll because you're motivated to find the next rewarding video, but you never feel content, never feel satisfied, because the serotonin system, the system that says, "This is enough, you can stop now," isn't being engaged. That's the mechanism. Variable reward schedules trigger repeated dopamine spikes. Over 3 to 6 months, your brain adapts through receptor downregulation and baseline reduction. Normal activities stop producing sufficient dopamine to register as pleasurable. You experience chronic wanting without satisfaction because dopamine is hyperactive while serotonin remains suppressed. But does this actually happen? Let's look at what research shows, with important caveats. A 2025 review published by the National Institutes of Health synthesized 27 neuroimaging studies, including functional MRI, structural MRI, and PET imaging, examining heavy social media use and reward network alterations. The conclusion: heavy social media use, particularly short-form video, consistently shows reduced capacity to experience pleasure from non-digital activities. This correlates with altered activation patterns in the nucleus accumbens and ventral striatum, regions central to reward processing. Effect sizes ranged from approximately 0.5 to 0.9, depending on measurement method. However, critical limitations. This is a review study, synthesizing correlational research. The majority of included studies are observational, not experimental. Most samples are Western, English-speaking populations. Causal direction remains debated. But the consistency across 27 independent studies from multiple research groups using different methodologies suggests this is a real, measurable phenomenon, not an artifact of any single flawed study. Researchers at Oxford tracked 169 adolescents for 2 years using functional MRI, measuring neural response to social feedback at 3 time points. They found that adolescents who showed initially heightened reward responsivity to likes and positive comments, followed by decreases over 2 years, were significantly more likely to develop addiction-like social media use symptoms in later adolescence. This pattern, initial hypersensitivity followed by desensitization, is the hallmark of tolerance development. The brain needed progressively more social validation to achieve the same reward response. This is the same process seen in substance addiction. Limitations. Sample size is moderate, 169 participants. Limited to adolescents, findings may not generalize to adults. Correlation established, but causality not experimentally proven. Individual differences were substantial. Not all adolescents showed this pattern. The largest study in this domain tracked over 8,300 children aged 9 to 11 using the Adolescent Brain Cognitive Development Study dataset. Researchers measured fronto-striatal connectivity, the brain network responsible for impulse control, delayed gratification, and executive function. Children with high screen time, defined as more than 4 hours daily, showed significantly weaker fronto-striatal connectivity. Effect size, Cohen's d, equals 0.43, statistically significant at p less than 0.001. Longer screen exposure mediated the negative effect of reward sensitivity on inhibitory control network development. Translation: the brain networks that help you say no to immediate rewards and yes to long-term goals develop more slowly in high screen time children. This isn't about willpower, it's about neurobiology. Critical caveat: screen time is a broad category, not specific to short-form video. The design is correlational. Baseline differences may predict both screen use and weak inhibitory control, making causal direction unclear. But with over 8,000 participants, this is our most robust evidence that something measurable is happening. A study published February 2025 in the journal Neuroimage used structural MRI and transcriptomic analysis to examine individuals with short video addiction symptoms. Researchers found increased gray matter volume in the cerebellum and orbitofrontal cortex, regions critical for decision-making, reward processing, and emotional regulation. Increased gray matter volume sounds positive, but researchers suggest this reflects compensatory neuroplasticity, the brain working harder to maintain control against constant dopamine bombardment, or structural hyperactivation from repeated overstimulation. Either interpretation signals the brain is adapting to an abnormal environment. At the genetic level, specific genes involved in excitatory and inhibitory neuron communication showed altered expression patterns, predominantly during adolescence. This suggests short-form exposure may influence not just brain activity, but brain structure and gene expression. Limitations: cross-sectional design, a snapshot in time, not before and after. Non-clinical population, so findings reflect correlations in the general population, not diagnosed addiction. Gene expression patterns don't prove causation. We can't definitively say videos caused these changes. Research published by the National Institutes of Health in January 2025 examined how genetic variations affect susceptibility to algorithm-driven addiction patterns. The key finding: adolescents with genetic variations in dopamine receptor genes, specifically dopamine D2 receptor polymorphisms and variations in dopamine-degrading enzymes, show increased susceptibility to algorithm-driven compulsive use. This explains why some people can casually scroll for 20 minutes and stop, while others find themselves stuck for 3 hours. It's not a moral failing, it's partly genetics. If you have genetic variations affecting dopamine receptor density or dopamine metabolism, you're more vulnerable to the variable reward schedules platforms use. Important nuance: possessing risk alleles doesn't guarantee addiction. Gene-environment interactions are complex. Environmental factors, family support, peer culture, stress levels, also matter enormously. Genetics are predispositions, not destiny. Multiple converging lines of evidence support these findings. Research using functional near-infrared spectroscopy suggests that immediately after social media use, brain regions responsible for working memory and impulse control showed decreased activity. The effect appears temporary but demonstrates immediate cognitive impairment following each session. Research on attention spans and working memory, published in June 2025, found negative correlations between excessive social media use and sustained attention. Frequent exposure to rapid, fragmented content overstimulates cognitive processes, leading to decreased working memory capacity and impaired cognitive control. A 2025 Nature study tracking children over 2 years found that screen time positively associated with ADHD symptom development, with cortical volume partially mediating the relationship, suggesting brain structural changes may partially explain the association. But here's where honest presentation requires acknowledging complexity. Not all research agrees on causality or severity. A study examining personality traits found that when controlling for baseline neuroticism, conformity, and openness, individual traits predicted substantial variance in symptom development, sometimes more than platform use itself. This suggests pre-existing traits drive both algorithm use and symptoms more than algorithms independently drive symptoms. This doesn't mean platforms are harmless. It means causality isn't simple. The most likely reality, bidirectional causality. Individuals with certain traits are drawn to heavy use, and heavy use exacerbates those traits. It's a feedback loop, not a one-way street. Additionally, approximately 15 to 25% of heavy users show clinically significant symptoms. 40 to 50% show moderate symptoms. The remainder show minimal measurable impact. This distribution likely reflects the genetic vulnerability we discussed. Those 15 to 25% with severe symptoms may have dopamine receptor polymorphisms or metabolic variations, while those showing minimal impact may have protective genetic variants or beneficial environmental factors. Individual variation is enormous and depends on genetics, personality, age, family environment, and usage patterns. What we genuinely don't know yet. Long-term developmental outcomes. Will Gen Z adolescents who grew up with short form show permanent differences in adulthood? We need 20-year follow-up studies that don't exist yet. Reversibility of changes. Preliminary evidence from digital detox studies, ranging from 72 hours to several weeks of abstinence, shows measurable brain recalibration. Neuroplasticity suggests recovery is possible, but we don't have long-term data on whether full recovery occurs or whether residual deficits remain. Cross-cultural generalization. Nearly all research is Western, English-speaking. We don't know if findings apply globally. So we've covered the mechanism, the evidence supporting it, the complexities that prevent simple causal claims, and what remains genuinely unknown. That's the current state of scientific understanding as of February 2026. Which brings us to a question that moves beyond what data can answer. We've examined dopamine systems, variable reward schedules, neural adaptation timelines, and what 20-plus neuroimaging studies actually show. You now understand the mechanism more precisely than most neuroscience undergraduates. But here's what research can't tell us yet: how this plays out in your specific context, your genetics, your personality, your usage patterns, your environment. These shape how algorithmic influence actually affects you. If you've recognized yourself in this analysis, If reading feels impossibly slow, if conversation feels exhausting, if nothing brings pleasure anymore, you're not broken and you're not alone. Hundreds of people have shared their timelines in comments on similar analyses. How long they used short-form content before noticing symptoms, which activities stopped feeling rewarding first, whether attempts at recovery worked or failed. That specificity is revealing patterns research can't capture yet: genetic vulnerability, usage thresholds, recovery trajectories. Comments are open. Share your timeline. 3 questions. 1. How long did you use short-form content before noticing anhedonia? 2. Which normal activity stopped feeling rewarding first? 3. If you've tried reducing use, what happened? Your specificity helps distinguish what's universal from what's individual. This community grows when we map the mechanism together, not just consume the analysis passively. And if this kind of analysis, mechanism-focused, research-grounded, honest about uncertainty, is what you're looking for, subscribe. Next week, can your brain recover? What does neuroplasticity research actually show about reversibility timelines? That's next week. Shall we continue? We started with a question. When was the last time you finished a book, enjoyed a conversation, went for a walk without reaching for your phone? Now you understand why those activities feel unrewarding. Your behavior on short-form platforms triggered repeated dopamine spikes. Over 3 to 6 months, your brain adapted through compensatory downregulation, reducing dopamine receptors, lowering baseline production. Normal activities that used to produce sufficient dopamine to register as pleasurable no longer cross your elevated threshold. It's not that reading, conversation, or nature became boring. It's that your reward system recalibrated to supranormal stimulation. This doesn't mean you're broken. It means you're experiencing predictable neural adaptation to an engineered environment designed to maximize engagement through dopamine exploitation. The changes are real, measurable, and create genuine functional impairment. But preliminary evidence suggests neuroplasticity allows recovery through sustained behavioral change. Recovery isn't simple. It requires weeks to months of abstinence, active replacement of habits, and structural environment changes. It won't happen through willpower alone, because willpower is mediated by the prefrontal cortex, which is the exact region showing reduced function. The question worth sitting with: how much of what you experience as boredom with everyday life is accurate perception of unstimulating reality, and how much is your reward system's adaptation to hyper-stimulating digital environments, making normal stimulation register as insufficient? If you've been living in a world calibrated to volume 20, volume 5 isn't going to feel like anything. But that doesn't mean volume 5 is objectively quiet. It means your threshold shifted. And thresholds can shift back. The neuroscience suggests it's possible. The question is whether you're willing to endure the recalibration period.